Blake is here. Blake has been working in an area that's near and dear to me. I love it. And I can't say I love avalanches, but knowing what to do in mountainous terrain and snow and all that, and I really love it. So, you know, as a person who is older, I always knock on some kind of wood somewhere, because as safe as we all try to be, there are risks in the outdoors and when you're out there. So I appreciated Blake this morning talking about giving back, because that's exactly what this research that he's doing does. It gives back. And Blake's mentor is Tiffany Wynn, and she is, well, she's in Ohio right now, and she'll be able to see this recording. And it's been wonderful to work with Blake. So go for it. Your presentation.
All right, good morning, everybody. Thank you for being here. I'm looking forward to sharing my results and findings with you all, and hearing back and questions at the end. Before we begin, I just wanted to thank a few people I saw. This was a much larger undertaking than I ever anticipated, and it really, for the most part, positively impacted every facet of my life. And to have somebody there day in and day out that would just listen to or give me feedback, listen to my questions, who was not a backcountry skier, who had no interest in complexity theory, I was blown away on a daily basis with how much she contributed to this. I also want to thank the avalanche forecasters up at Mount Washington and the AMC caretakers at Mount Washington. Having a site in the field, day in and day out, designated study, was incredibly helpful. I also made a huge error in assuming people could take a 27-question day in a winter environment on the trail. So the AMC caretakers kindly allowed me to use the hauling orders for about 2 months as my survey or my site to hand out my survey. And I really would not have been able to get any results back if it hadn't been for that. So I'm greatly appreciative of their efforts. So just wanted to thank a couple professionals in the industry. It's amazing sometimes when you send questions out into like ether and you actually get responses from authors and pro skiers and all these people that have something to contribute to your work, and a little piece of validation while you're from SPSS is nice. So let's get started. Today we're going to discuss preemptive decision making in backcountry skiing and how to diversify risk management strategies in complex environments. This second piece, the diversifying risk management strategies, I hope that there's something in there that you can take away and apply to your own work, your own studies. That's been one of my favorite parts of Prescott. I always find something from other people's work that I can use in my own. So I'll do my best to not make assumptions in terms of using certain language. If you have any questions at the end, please feel free to ask me if it's as basic as what is an avalanche. I did that in my qualifying presentation. Some of my research questions. One was, do individual conceptions of avalanche terrain actually translate into tangible risk reduction measures? And we're actually not going to talk about that too much today. And the short answer is not really. We'll see in the slides later on in my results. People weren't taking the standard measures that they should in order to keep themselves safe in the mountains. And then what strategies can be implemented to create more robust preemptive risk management protocols, specifically during the planning and approach phases. So as we're getting ready to head into the backcountry, as we're getting ready to head into that complex terrain, what are we doing? What are the conversations like? And how do they affect our overall safety of that trip? I'm going to get a quick peek into my brain here. So this was the past 7-8 months of my life. I was looking at this one side of the equation, the pre-trip, and I looked at everything: failure to systems thinking, to neurobiology, metacognition, actually metacognition a lot. I was key on that about this. Traps, which Ian McCann has done a ton, naturalistic decision making, et cetera, et cetera. And they all role in my thesis and in my paper, but for the presentation today, we're going to focus on gender diversity. I'll explain why in a little bit. The state of backcountry skiing right now. Last month there was an article in magazine. The author loudly proclaimed that what was once a fringe culture is now firmly mainstream. Mainstream, yeah, but it's definitely growing popularity. I think 85% increase in gear sales over the past 5 years, 4 years. We had about 5 million people going into the. I think that number is a little high. It's based off of gear sales, so whether or not that gear actually makes it out of the car or the living room and each train is questionable. So I'll put an asterisk next to it. What we do know is that over that same span of time, we've seen an increase in fatalities here in the United States. So we're now on average about 30 fatalities per year and 350 accidents, at least reported accidents, that are being brought back to the avalanche centers. The numbers a little higher. Bruce Edgerly, BCA, did an interesting study. He went and reviewed social media sites, so YouTube, Vimeo, Facebook, to find any videos that people were posting of themselves being caught. There's a much higher number of people actually getting caught in avalanche accidents that just go unreported. So, also interesting to note, we get the vast majority of our information about what people are doing right or wrong from accidents. So there's kind of a big gap in our information gathering system. We need more information coming from people that are doing things right on a daily basis. So basically field studies and field things kind of post hoc right now. This is what a lot of backcountry areas are looking like. It's getting busier and busier for sure. This is from Tuckerman Ravine, the ants marching. We analyze just this photo for the next hour, but we won't. But I just wanted to give you an insight, some insights what some of the trailheads are starting to look like. Again, it really is a catch-22. On the one hand, you're really excited to see people getting out and enjoying nature and not sitting in front of the TV. On the other hand, I really get bummed out some days because I want to myself. But it's definitely getting. We need to find a way to make our risk management strategies and the decisions that people are making in the field a bit better, a bit more robust. So quickly, what is an avalanche? It's a large mass in motion down a mountainside. We're concerned with snow avalanches, and specifically human-triggered avalanches. Avalanches are considered high-risk, low-probability events dominated by incomplete information. This information piece is really, really important because as an industry and community, people are just starting to recognize this. You are never going to be able to dial down a dynamic or complex system and understand it fully. So that reductionist means of pulling apart pieces and then reassembling it to assess how it's behaving right now and it will behave in the future just isn't possible. There's this little humility coming through in the industry right now saying, you know what, I may not know all the time, which is nice to see. Avalanches are what are known as black swan events. They exist out here in the outer edges of a normal bell curve distribution, so they happen frequently than we'd expect, but it's still, it's still something that's outside of our normal predictive models. This is from the Nassim Taleb's book, the Black Swan, appropriately. Black swans basically never existed until Australia. So maybe I went to Australia and said, oh yeah, swans exist. Why it's important is because nobody talks about them. They escape our models, as we saw in the bell curve, and so they're events that you would feel ashamed discussing in public because they don't seem plausible. It's really, really, really important. Avalanche accidents, when people are interviewed after the fact, there's always somebody in that group who said, I kind of had a feeling that something wasn't going, but I didn't want to speak up on anything, especially if they feel they have as much experience as other people. So this denial of plausibility manifests in ski groups in order to maintain the social homeostasis. You don't want to be the person that rocks the boat. And we need to change that. We need more boat rockers. A good example of this is Aran Desert. In 2012, there was a relatively large, well-known avalanche in Tunnel Creek, which is in North Cascades. Unfortunately, 3 professional skiers passed away in that avalanche. Aran she worked as a ski instructor at the resort, and she just got looped into this group on that day. And as you can see here, she said, they're all so intelligent and driven and powerful, riding with prowess. Everything in my mind was going, wanting to tell them to stop. She didn't. She was smart enough to turn around on her own and just walked away. Anything. Unfortunately, we can all kind of imagine the impact would have been if she had stopped the group as a whole and externalized what she said after the fact. Similarly, this is one of the largest avalanches ever occur in Mount Washington. Fortunately nobody was hurt. I was away at a wedding this weekend, so it would have been nice to actually speak to people in the moment last spring. I I did interview a couple of people in this group. There are two groups. There's one right here, there's another right there, and you can see somebody got really, really lucky earlier in the day, about 20 minutes beforehand. They actually skied right down the center of this and didn't trigger, which is miraculous. This is a R4 avalanche, which means it basically has the destructive power to take down a small house, and the debris is about 20 feet deep. So this is pretty significant. Anyway, one of the people that I interviewed in this group, she said the exact same thing. I knew it was getting a lot warmer. I didn't trust that we should have been on that slope. It's right at 38 degrees. Everything was going off with a bunch of locals that we all know well who've been skiing that mountain for the better part of 30 years, and she didn't speak up. So this is a consistent theme. So terrain complexity. This picture also serves to highlight two types of complex systems. We have adaptive systems, which are the people and the individuals. Complex physical system, which is the actual environment. So the complex physical system is what we as an industry, as a community, have looked at for a very long time. And I'll show you how we do that in a second. The complex adaptive system, the boundaries, the actors, our desires, our experience, the group dynamic, our risk tolerance as a group, has really been ignored. There have been some people, Laura Adams, Ian McCann, Bruce Tremper, who for a long time have been doing really, really good work in trying to bring this to the forefront, but it really just hasn't received the type of press that some of the more traditional methods of the environment have. So this complex system is what we'll talk about pretty much for the rest of the day. And obviously where they intersect, right here in the middle, is your skiing experience. So why complexity? Some of these slides are going to be text heavy, I apologize. To improve the ability to prevent disasters from occurring again, to mitigate their unintended consequences in the future, one needs to gain a fundamental understanding of the emergencies that result from intricate interconnection of complex system components, including the humans in those systems. So we need to understand the humans in this system. What we've done so far, for those of you that are unfamiliar, so beacon shovel probe. This is the equivalent of wearing your seatbelt when you go into the backcountry. Everybody should have it. If they don't go skiing. Or ski in a really mellow place that's not that much fun. About half the population we'll see in a little bit still doesn't carry beacon shovel probe, which is kind of amazing. The new and improved avalanche airbag system, which actually is having a positive effect if you were trying to survive an avalanche. It obviously has no effect if you're trying to avoid an avalanche. And again, this kind of linear reductionist means of breaking down the snowpack, understanding the layers, understanding how they behave. This has been around for a long time. However, as Bruce Tremper said recently in an article, good data does not necessarily mean you make good decisions. And that's what we're seeing over and over again. And then we have our terrain assessment down here as well. So I just want to pause for a second and just really clarify that I'm not proposing an and or so that we get away with this. These have all been wonderful means and methods of keeping yourself safe in the backcountry for a very long time. And we're not getting rid of that. We just need to add on another layer of our risk management strategies. Again, these are also, just before we move on to the next slide, these are often mislabeled as safety devices. These are rescue devices. These don't keep you safe. They only work if you ever get involved in an accident. So what I'm interested in, that's way more green than I anticipated. What I'm interested in is this group right here around the fire. This was actually taken before the 2012 avalanche in Tunnel Creek. So what are the discussions that are going on here? Tunnel Creek was the quote before from Aaron Desert, where 3 professional skiers passed away in the North Cascades. So this is literally from the night before. So what type of conversation is going on here? Who's in the conversation? Who has the loudest voice in that conversation? And what are the goals and the desires that are being established at that point that will then ultimately ripple effect across? The goals and desires of the most recent ISSW, so it's International Snow Science Workshop. Goals and desires are something they focused on heavily, particularly this idea of diversifying your desires to meet the actual system that you're engaging with. Triggers are important, and I'll explain why. So 90% of fatal avalanches are triggered by the victim or someone in the victim's party. This is consistent over time. So the question is, why don't people just avoid being in places where they could? One of the problems is the familiarity heuristic. So our past actions are proof that a particular behavior is appropriate. Ian McCann in 2002 listed out 6 common heuristic traps that we are all susceptible to in the backcountry. The familiarity heuristic is one that's probably the most prominent. 69% of accidents occur on slopes that the victim was familiar with. So, yeah, I'm sorry.
One sentence. Heuristic trap is?
Oh, heuristic trap is a shortcut. So all of us do them every time. Like when we walked over to yoga, our mind had shortcuts because all of our experiences were like, I know how to cross a road. A trap is when the system changes, it doesn't allow that heuristic to work anymore, right? So that there's something in the environment that your brain isn't wired to recognize. Sorry about that. Avalanche terrain is considered a wicked environment because the frequent false positive feedback skiers receive. You can usually ski an avalanche-prone slope 95% of the time, and you won't get caught in an accident during moderate, considerable forecasts. All right, so that's a lot of feedback that you're actually not getting. You can do everything wrong and still walk home and go back and hang out with your buddies at the bar at the end of the day. A really good way of looking at this, though, it's one of my favorite graphs. All right, it's from the Seam to Lead. All right, 1,001 days in the life of a Thanksgiving Day turkey. So for 1,000 days, a Thanksgiving Day turkey is psyched, especially if it's free range. All right, it's getting fed well, it's roaming around, it's doing its turkey thing, and then on day 1,001, its entire world is flipped upside down and becomes dinner. And this is what often happens for backcountry skiers who frequent a particular area or zone over and over and over again. They get this feedback that it's a friendly environment, that I know what to do in this place, I recognize this system, this is how I'm going to behave, and then all of a sudden that system changes, oftentimes in very imperceptible ways, and a disaster happens. These are also retrospectively easy to unravel, but prospectively very hard to predict, right? So when we look back on these avalanches, a lot of times the reports will say, oh, why didn't you recognize that red flag, or why didn't you see this? But that hindsight bias is something that really needs to be dealt with during our analysis phase of accidents. So who's the most common turkey? Me, in all seriousness. Men between the ages of 18 and 40 are most at risk. They account for 92% of fatalities. Women account for 8%. Almost all avalanche fatalities in recent decades have been males, very skilled, very fit, educated, intelligent, middle class, between the ages of 18 and 40. I was looking for photos of somebody being an idiot out there, and I found one of me. This is an avalanche that I was next to skiing by myself, which was a horrible decision in the Idaho backcountry because I thought I knew the terrain well. I'd skied there for years and years, and I was like, I can just go out by myself and do my thing. So, poor decision. This is also the time that I realized that there was a big gap in my learning that I needed to fill. I thought I knew a lot at that point, and I did not. So this is where my research took place, Tuckerman Ravine. It's cold, it's windy, it's icy. If you want to come hang out, you're more than welcome. You'll see what's important. All these lines, a lot of people are like, we have avalanches on the East Coast? Yes. All these lines are the primary avalanche paths in Tuckerman Ravine. We have 14 primary avalanche paths. I stood down here with my adult trapper keeper, handing out surveys to people for about 2 months throughout February, March, and a little bit of April, as people ascended up the little head wall here and into the base of the ravine. A lot of people are unaware that when they get to the base of the ravine, they're already in avalanche terrain. They assume that they have to travel further up the mountain into one of the chutes or one of the couloirs in order to actually get into dangerous territory. But if you go, if you want to really geek out and go on YouTube, there are 3 or 4 avalanches that occur that rip off from the lip and the center head wall and the sluice. And in every single one of those avalanches, there's somebody, not only the person triggering it above, but there's somebody below who's unassociated with that party that also gets caught in the avalanche. So again, our perspective on the environment, we assume that we have to be in it, triggering it to be a part of it. We don't forecast being caught because of somebody else above us. I would stand in front of the avalanche bulletin most days and ask people to take a survey. There's a lot of people who didn't want to take the survey. There were a lot of people who were in a big rush. Seriously, they would cruise right now. And at first I took it personally, but then I saw them ignore the actual snow rangers and stuff like that. I was like, okay, that's not me. But there were a lot of people in a big rush. I had 40 total. I had dismissed 1 survey. It was a much smaller sample than I anticipated getting, but I'll explain one of the variables as to why that is. I did allow people the time to sit and discuss this avalanche advisory. The avalanche advisory is posted right here, and then each of the paths that I highlighted in the last image is rated for the day, so high, moderate, considerable, depending on the avalanche hazard. But I wanted people to have the time to read that. I didn't want to interrupt their decision-making process, and then once they were finished, I'd ask them if they want to take the survey. So as I said, I was really interested in considerable and moderate forecasts. I'll be honest, people did a very good job. On the few high days that we had, nobody showed up. I just sat there by myself drawing. And then on the low days, again, we don't really have many fatalities at that time. So considerable and moderate account for 63% of all fatalities. These are really hard times to judge what the correct behavior is. High and extreme are pretty obvious. You don't want to be there. Low, let's go have fun. But that moderate considerable is a very fine line to play with. So my research approach, we're going to delve into my own results now. But I had the post-positive, positivist, critical, realist, all of that that's in my thesis. But quite frankly, I took a feminist approach. I paid close attention to who's being heard and who's being excluded. That was really important to me. Is what is the guiding voice in the system, and where's the absence, where's the gap? And I really did this in order to address broader social issues such as empowerment, inequality, and oppression. I think it's important. This is my lens, but I don't pretend to think that it's the only lens. So I want to make sure that whatever research comes out of this, that it's applied elsewhere as well. So a good example of this will be the literature review. If you want any of these books, I'm more than happy to share them with you afterwards. I broke it up into 2 sections: avalanche-specific literature, and then more other resources. The reason the literature review is important is because it ended up being weird literature. And what I mean by that is Western, educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic societies that are guiding this conversation. I did that. I was literally sat at my desk one day. I was like, I wonder who's writing these books. And I just sat down and realized that everything that I had selected at random was part of this weird literature. Unfortunately, the weirder you are, the more you perceive a world full of separate objects rather than relationships. The more you seek analytical thinking style, focusing on categories and laws, rather than a holistic style, focusing on patterns and context, right? So as I explained earlier, we've done this kind of linear assessment of the train, but we need this more holistic type of thinking coming in. So if we have this overarching voice that's weird in nature, it's going to be hard to ignore that. We also have the hard science versus social science. So 675 pages of avalanche-specific literature, only 40 total pages are dedicated to human factors. So it's about 6% of all the books. It's really only Bruce Tremper's book last spring who delves into System 1 versus System 2 type thinking and begins to go into the cognitive process of decision making. And that's his first chapter, which doesn't seem like a big deal, I'm sure, for most people, but for us it's kind of a big deal. He put that at the front. We're discontinued. All the books reviewed, 27% were written by a single female author, 13.5% by female and male co-authors, and 59% of the books had a male author. So again, looking at the voice. I won't go through all this, but I had mixed methods, scale survey, then interviews afterwards, and then ethnographic field notes, because even if you didn't want to take my survey. Results. 40 participants took the survey. One was dismissed, as I mentioned. So I had 39 total that I put into SPSS. About 89%, so 35, women are 10%. Interestingly, this correlates pretty well with studies. Case, sample size, population size of 100. She has had almost the first 90% male, 9.5% female for her study. So it overlaps pretty well. This is going to be pretty important.
Interaction?
Yeah, I'm sorry.
It's such a perfect example. So what Blake did is he took his demographics and he said, well, what else is out there? Are my demographics anywhere in the realm of what other people have? And yes, they were. So that was the thing you did, looking at somebody else's demographics too and saying, gee, somebody else found this. You may be wrong.
Yeah,
but we're starting to get research. Excellent job of doing that.
Thank you. So ski reception in Mount Washington, this is going to be really important to hold on to for the next couple slides. And I'm just going to direct you to this 69 and 23%. So 69% of the population said, yes, it is a very dangerous, I agree, it's a very dangerous place to ski. 23%, yep, I agree. And no big deal with the statement at all. Okay, now keep that, all right. There was no correlation, so men and women were just as likely to perceive it as a dangerous place to ski. Number of years in the backcountry, about half the population has 0 to 5 years, a quarter 5 to 10, another 10 plus years. Okay, so remember, this is a really dangerous place to ski. But we still have over half our population not traveling with pro. Again, 5 miles per hour down the highway, take your seatbelt off. Are you going to get in an accident? Depending on how good a driver you are, not. But if you get in an accident without that seatbelt on, it's going to be a problem. So a lot of people are still deciding to drive down the highway without their seatbelt. Level of training, I was really shocked by this. The vast majority of the population does not have avalanche training at all. We only had, I think, 10 not even 10 participants that had level 1, 1 participant with level 2, 1 participant with level 3, and I appreciated the other. Some people qualify backcountry as education. I somewhat agree with. Still, again, there's a huge gap there in terms of formal training and thinking the backcountry. Motivations for skiing. This is one of my favorites. Everybody's having fun, which is great, except for the fact that a lot of, in a previous study, those who scored 5 for participation in my sport, which is backcountry skiing, were more likely to use an avalanche accident. It's positively associated with sensation seeking. So at first, it seemed like 9. I was like, all right, that's great. I wish that more people are out there for physical exercise or to enjoy nature. But this fun, it seems, is actually really doesn't. What it allows for is this kind of almost excuse to kind of go do you want, right? It's like, oh, well, this is fun for me, and you don't really have to qualify and narrow that down a little bit. And then here's my dimly lit bulb, and we'll wrap up the conversation with this. This has really just been in the back of my head since my first avalanche course, which was basically that I remember my teacher saying, all will be safer if you're traveling in the backcountry with women. And whenever I investigated all these other aspects, I would just come back to this. I would come back to these statements that there's evidence that males may be more likely to report an avalanche incident than females, and then perhaps even more importantly, there's evidence that males who travel with females less than 75% of the time are more likely to experience an avalanche incident. So the author Emery repeated the study in 2010 with similar results. So here are some of my gender-specific questions from my survey. I asked people if they often ski in mixed gender groups. Yep, most people agreed with that. Some people strongly disagreed. Pretty even distribution though. Are people more comfortable skiing in single gender groups? And most people strongly disagree with that actually. Then I asked, do they ski in groups where women are the primary leader? And this was the big one for me. And this is where the vast majority of the population said they strongly disagreed, and it was really only the female respondents that said that they agreed with that statement, that they frequently travel in groups where women are the primary leader. And you can see that, we won't go all the way through this in the interest of time. You can see for the male distribution, strongly disagreed, 26 males disagreed, 5 disagreed, and then it was the female population, only 1 person disagreed, and then 2 agreed, 1 neutral. So across the board, what does this look like for the entire system? Well, women comprise 40% of the alpine skiing population, 36% of the free skiing population, which is a very aggressive style of skiing. But they only comprise about 27% of the backcountry skiing population and 11% of the guiding population. Interesting to note that AMGA doesn't delineate what that is. So that could be a rock guide, that could be a mountaineering guide. Doesn't necessarily mean a ski mountaineering guide. So we're not really sure. I'm not really sure anyway at this point. If that means that women are actually ski mountaineering and guiding. We'll skip the video. Sorry, but it's pretty funny. So the results from my interviews. This is from pro female skier. She said girls are guiding, but we need more. So there can be more female mentors to bring in new skiers and make it easier for girls to get ahead. This mentorship idea came up a lot in all my interviews. In the guides world, it's a little bit like a boys' club. Guys have a way of talking to each other. Women sometimes take on this male effect. So they say, oh, my bad, sorry. Yep.
5 minutes.
Oh, 5 minutes. Fine. We're going to do micro machine talking in a second. But guys have a way of talking to each other, so it's this idea that you have to change your identity in order to have your voice heard. And then this arrived yesterday in my email. I was so happy, I was so grateful. This is an article from a female guide, IFMGA guide. It said, as women, we have believed that we don't belong among IFMGA mountain guides, so we legitimize our own inferiority. It's reinforced because we feel defeated before we even start. Fewer women do it, so we have fewer role models. Going back to the first quote, and it's become a cycle. So diversity and risk management, why is this important other than because it's the right thing to do? Well, people with different ideas are treated differently, so they have different experiences and ways of managing life events, or, like in the second quote, they have different tools of managing those events. So an industry that's constantly looking for the newest and greatest tools, it's kind of strange and unfortunate that they're overlooking the most obvious, which is a diverse perspective. How can we influence a complex system? We can change the goals. So adjust goals and desires to match the conditions of the system. The goal of the system is a leverage point. Change paradigms. Right? So this shared social agreement about the nature of reality, that has yet to really be defined for backcountry skiers. And then transcend paradigms is the most important one. Remain unattached. We'll recognize that no one person's view is accurate. We have to kind of put them all together. And then this is probably the key. I won't go all the way through the slide, but encouraging diverse perspectives. Just because we have diversity in the group. It's only going to work, it's only going to benefit if we actually allow those voices to be heard. Just the presence of it doesn't make it effective. So for diverse groups to perform well, people must feel as though their identities have been validated and their contributions verified. This is really, really important and something that can be incorporated into avalanche training. And then a holistic checklist that I'm working on to distribute to skiers that head in the backcountry. Checklists right now are really focused on terrain, gear, kind of the standard, what's been around for about the past decade or so. I'm trying to create something that's a little more open-ended and basically asking ourselves the hard questions before we start a trip. So what are my desires? What are your desires? You know, how are we going to challenge challenge individual and group assumptions today? And how will today's decisions affect long-term goals? I really like Bruce Schemper's what are my personal disaster factors? So what are the things that I'm really bad at that I'm going to bring to this group? I'm really goal-oriented, and I like to go fast would be the things that I would bring to the group. And then I've created my blog. It's about to join with another blog. It's intended to be kind of a safe space that people can share their experiences in the backcountry and look at the backcountry in a little different way, not just kind of the big mountain backflip, more a reflective type place. Feedback's been lukewarm. And then I just want to give you know, the image from the first time I ever went backcountry skiing. This is in the North Cascades. I really had no idea what I was doing, but I had two great guides that day. And I got to the bottom down a horseshoe bend, and the girl who's guiding the group on that day looked at me and said, you know, your life's about to change. And it really, really has in so many ways, in so many aspects that I could never imagine. So thank you to them for that gift, and I hope that this is a small piece to contribute back to that community. And then if anybody wants resources, more than happy to share with you. That's it, guys. Questions? So you just sat for a long time, I'm sorry. But you had yoga this morning to start. So. Yeah, I'm open to any questions. I also realize that this is like a very narrow window to look into. So even if it's like, what does that word mean? Go for it. Griff, I'm sorry.
So I'm not backcountry skier and haven't ever taken an AE course. And I'm wondering how much do they already teach about complex adaptive systems?
Not much at all. So in the United States at least, right? And so this is a very narrow slice to look at. In the United States, it's a really 2-day course. It's meant to be a 3-day course. It's about a 2-day course, and it really focuses on getting you the skills to know that it's a dangerous place. So you're really focusing on digging pits, how to analyze those pits. They're doing a little more to introduce kind of that group dynamic and who you choose to ski with and not choose to ski with. But it's certainly not going into the depth of, I mean, perhaps a little bit, but you know, really assessing like what are your goals for the day and how are those going to impact where you travel. Are they diverse goals? Do you have more than one goal? I don't know if that's really being communicated. I think some avalanche educators probably are, but as a standard, I don't think so. I could be wrong.
Do you feel like your work could impact that at all? Like, is that a direction?
That's the goal. At some point, yeah. Yep, sorry.
I got a question from Sarah Julies.
Whoa!
Asking, in an ideal world, how would you revamp AE training to best incorporate your findings?
So, I would have it split. I'd be a little more honest in terms of who's teaching that course. I think that the terrain, the navigation, the snow pit analysis is really important, but I think at some point in an ideal world, it would be 50-50. Where you have a systems thinking, social science approach to what you're learning, and then you have a more rigid, linear type thinking approach. In an ideal world. So I don't even know. Brett?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I was just curious to see, like, as you were doing your research and kind of looking at complex adaptive systems in regards to backcountry skiing, do you look at other sports, other extreme sports?
Great question. Yeah, so I did look a little bit at kayaking and rock climbing, and I didn't find too much in like that group dynamic. Climbers tend to be a bit safe because of their, like, even if you're placing tradition, that system isn't as dynamic as a snowpack. So I think like the rates, accidents, and how those accidents or why those accidents occur are a bit different. So it was hard for me to take like basically that information and apply it to what I'm doing. I mean, I think it'd be an interesting study to look at like, you know, as a complex adaptive system, how climbing groups work, particularly alpine climbing groups, which may have more than 2 people. That would be pretty interesting.
Did you find any literature that was specific to whitewater kayaking, or that was just
I'm sure it exists. I just scratched the surface because like the idea popped in my head one day, but I didn't delve too far.
Do you know anything back in that area?
Yeah,
I don't know anything that's been done in that area in terms of looking at kind of group dynamics and kayaking and kind of education in regards to complex dynamic systems. It certainly doesn't occur within the American Pool Association as part of any of the education. There's not a, it's different in the whitewater kayaking world. There's not the same sort of kind of consistent coherent standards as there are in the skiing world. So something that's probably weird.
And I think, well, one of the things Blake said, it took so long even in this area to get complexity theory, which we all should be somewhat familiar with as you make it, and everyone like, what? Because it's so important, especially in adventure education, because we're often in very complex systems that again, the whole, if you haven't read a lot about some of the heuristics and heuristic traps, there's the authors that Blake has mentioned, and Sean Galloway is another author that about them a lot. You know, to be thinking about those things because we're out there all the time. That complexity theory without even really knowing.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's wonderful to bring it up.
Sorry.
Blake?
Yeah.
So,
Sorry, your name?
Randy,
Randy.
so I guess my question is, now that you've done the research and you've come this far, like, what do you think you're gonna do to continue contributing to the backcountry community?
So that's a big question. I'm gonna finish my thesis. I'm gonna make all my corrections, and then I don't really know. I have like that's been. One of my readers, Blaze Reed, he's a forecaster in Colorado, so kind of pick his brain about like what's the next step in terms of research. This brought up. I mean, again, this is such a small slice in terms of questions that were brought up for me in terms of like areas that need to be investigated. So basically, who's doing similar research and do they need help? I think it's kind of the next step. I think Bruce Trumper would be a nice person to get to know, but he's also just like, I don't know, this incredible human being.
That's how you involve in search and rescue and things of that sort, or?
Nope, so I'll be helping out on some avalanche courses this winter, and then hopefully getting my ITC next winter, because they don't have any East Coast offerings this year, which is kind of fun. But yeah, that's kind of the trajectory.
Sorry,
No, that's alright.
I was just interested, did you find any literature that was kind of relevant to like differentiating decision-making processes and individuals and how long they've spent engaged in backcountry skiing? I know you had some of that out there in terms of who did what, but
So you're asking how long they've been backcountry skiing, and then like what their methods are for making decisions?
yeah, or sort of, you know, in their intentionality of why they're engaging, sort of that graph you showed of, well, I'm out here just for fun, but the progression of why you participate and why you go in the first place and how that changes in the evolution of that over time. And then ultimately how that evolution impacts the decision-making processes.
Yeah. So the evolution I have not looked at, and that would be a great study. Emery, the lady who's responsible for the two quotes about basically gender having influence, she did do a study on motivations and how those impact. But I don't think anybody's really followed long term. Like, so here's year 1 or 2 of your experience, and then what are your motivations at year 10 or 12? That would be pretty interesting. Yep.
And also integrating more gender diversity into the instruction side of things is one way of kind of maybe kind of quietly introducing some of these perspectives in. There are some organizations that have started to do it intentionally. So that means when they schedule instructors for a course, they specifically they'll fly in from a distance if there's no local male or female available, so they get a mixed gender team or one that's representative at least for whatever audience they're going with.
And that was actually part of something I wanted to study, but again, just got kind of like pushed on the other pile of papers. Was so women-specific backcountry avalanche education. So how is that information presented differently, and how is it received differently than what I would normally experience in a level 1 or level 2? I've kind of been asking that question, but not with enough, I guess, volume.
Daniel mentioned that introducing this topic to others is one way to approach that, but like your data said that most people aren't receiving an education.
Yeah, exactly.
So, what's your thoughts on that? Like, how do we reach those people? It seems like a bigger societal issue, like getting everyone to look through a feminist lens would be.
Well, yeah, so there's two things, right? I mean, there's one, which is how do we get more people to take courses? Unfortunately, a lot of people will go take, many people will go take a course after an absent. So once that like whoa, this is real, then they'll go take a course. Whereas very like I only say this because I spoke with him last week, but one of the guys I'll be working with this winter, he said, you know, a lot of women use the avalanche courses as an introduction to the backcountry. So like that's their starting point. But how do we get that kind of that feminist lens introduced, like consciously introduced into that learning process? I'll be reading a lot this winter. I don't know.
Can I ask one more question? So as I've worked in this field with men that supposedly are trained to consider women's perspective, and yet it seems like there's still decisions that happen that where like my voice isn't heard.
Yeah.
And so I wonder like what that is. Is that like a willingness to take risks? And like you even spoke about traveling into training that you knew you shouldn't be traveling into by yourself. And like I don't know, just something about the willingness to take risks from the men's perspective.
Well, I think that's the biggest piece of kind of what I tried to finish on the end there was we need as a group, as a community, both professionals and recreationists, to figure out a way to have different conversations and to have different voices heard, and also to understand, right? Like I think when we're creating mental models of the world that of our systems that we're about to engage in, yours is going to be very different than mine based upon your life experiences. So how can I create for myself a similar language so that I understand what you're trying to communicate and why you're trying to communicate it? I think that's a tall order for level 1 introductory course as well, or even 2. But there's got to be, I'm sure there's a way to do it.
Great information.
It's just, I really appreciate this. So I want to just thank you for this. I really enjoyed this.
Thank you.
And I just think it's absolutely so vital that these kinds of trainings on complex adaptive systems are integrated into instructional programs, whether it be backcountry skiing or whitewater kayaking or climbing. Because there are other often unseen risks that are present in cultural manifestations of these subcultures of extreme sports that present risks that fall outside the realm of preparedness in the way of what do I do to examine the terrain conditions, or what do I do to examine the river conditions? Have I taken a river safety course, for example, things like that. But then there are other things that lie outside the realm of that also need to be paid attention to. So I appreciate you bringing that up.
Really wonderful. I'd like to mention 4 things if I can remember more. I don't know if I can. Thing number 1, Bree Condon. Does anybody know her? Okay, she did her stuff on decision making. Also, great literature review in there, looking at slightly different way. But she talked about something that you did, Brett. She looked at like people who have done it for a long time, that they fall into like, I've done it a long time, I know what I'm doing here. So it's actually people who, it's not necessarily the beginners who are making the boo-boos. It may be people who have been doing it for a long time. So her thesis could be of interest to you. One interesting thing about voice being heard in feminist lens, with some folks who have done this whole risk stuff and looked at the literature, the weird literature that Blake describes discounts intuition. They equate intuition with gut feeling, which people who are more into complexity theory do not. Intuition is another way of knowing, very different from gut feeling. And gut feeling can come from a lot of things, but gut feeling can indicate intuition too. So just be aware that as you read the weird literature, I love that term, it will discount intuition in some ways. Sometimes it'll say, oh, informed intuition, but there's a whole, well, Sarah Gillings is on there, Brene Brown, and some other folks who are really talk about using intuition in a way that comes from that a different place than the gut feeling. So it's a voice that's been discounted.
I think Gary Klein has some good research and writing on that, natural decision making and recognition kind of decision making. So like following that.
What's his name?
Gary Klein. I'll double check resources.
And there's this guy whose last name is DeGavin, and he wrote The Gift of Fear. And he does a wonderful job of talking about intuition too, especially in regards to women and safety. He works for the CIA and other things like that, does trainings for them about using their intuition. another student, worked with me, did a whole thing on decision making, and he did a Delphi study. He's at Fort Lewis College. His name is, I'm embarrassed, I won't forget any of your names. Oh, come on.
Good.
So,
Is he a recent student?
yeah, what, 2 years ago?
Aaron Wall.
Yeah, Aaron Ball, thank you so much. Jonathan Aaron Ball, to be exact,
Yeah.
Aaron Ball. So his is another good thesis to look at for people interested in decision making and things like that. Yes. And next is, we've done a lot of sitting and a lot of this and a lot of that, but we're supposed to get lunch, bring it up here, and do our opening circle. And the good news, bad news about that is it's great to have a